Hey there, everyone. So today, in celebration of Bloomsday, I was thinking about Joyce as a figure of influence, one that we have a sort of colloquial holiday that we share, where we all go through and we're reading passages of Ulysses and thinking about it critically. And it made me think of a chapter in the book which really gets to the heart of this concern with the artist, which is the 9th chapter, Scylla and Charybdis. And in this chapter, Stephen Dedalus and his friends meet in the National Library of Ireland, and they are talking about, and Stephen is developing, a theory concerning fatherhood and artistry regarding Shakespeare. And it's a very convoluted one that basically amounts to an egoistic understanding of the work of art, where the artist takes the progenitors that came before them and creates them, such that their forebears actually become their children. The son becomes the father of his own father. And this is used in a sort of strange way to say that Hamlet is the grandfather of his ghost, which is his father in Hamlet. And it's very convoluted, very inflected by theological and academic discourse, and it's very marred in really what concerns me the most, the extent to which an author owns what they create. Because at the very end of this chapter, and Stephen has explicated this whole theory, he's asked whether or not he believes in it, and he says no. And I think this is a really interesting gesture to me. I have positive and negative interpretations regarding it, and I would just like to sift through this chapter, explicate some of the things that's being said, and talk about the various critical perspectives from which one can interpret it. I think there's a couple important sort of contextual points to keep in mind when interpreting and reading this episode, which is that it only concerns male subjects. Men are the ones talking about artistic creation, and it is framed through the traditional sort of classical assumption that masculinity equals activeness or autonomy, and femininity equals passiveness or receptivity. So the male, for example, is the one who uses the active sexual gesture of insemination to start the gestational process, and the woman is the sort of passive receptacle, the womb through which the artistic thing develops, which started from the male impregnating force. And this imagery of pregnancy and sexuality is a metaphor for artistic creation that Joyce plays on a lot, especially in this chapter. And in addition to that androcentric discourse, we also have a very theological discourse. This is constantly inflected through references to the Father and the Son in the Trinity, right? Of God the Father and Jesus the Son. And then you also have the Holy Spirit, which often takes on a sort of maternal and background role in the way that it's framed in Ulysses. And it's important to note that Joyce is playing on these frameworks. In many ways, the characters accept these discourses because they are products of their culture. It sort of highlights the discursive limitations of any utterance. So, for example, Stephen, steeped in classical education as he is, says, "Formless spiritual, Father, Word, and Holy Breath. All-Father, the heavenly man, Jesus Christos, magician of the beautiful, the Logos who suffers in us at every moment. This, verily, is that. I am the fire upon the altar. I am the sacrificial butter." Right, so the sacrifice on the altar is making us think of Isaac being sacrificed by Abraham to God, and right as this sacrifice is about to take place, there is a divine intervention, and this sort of divine link is always something that is sort of tenuously held on to keep this theory of creation working throughout the chapter. That there has to be some sort of transcendent jump or discontinuity that makes up for the difference and sort of imbues the Father's creative gesture into the Son and allows for some sense of continuity across the various instantiations of Father and Son of Son and Son of Son, etc., etc. So Stephen is sort of posturing himself as almost a sort of martyr for his own creation, whereby in being the martyr, he becomes, or rather shows himself already to be the Father, which is a markedly theological point, right? Because Jesus is already the Father. He is consubstantial with the Father, and yet he is distinct. He is embodied here on earth and is crucified. So there's a lot of attempts for Stephen to try to inflect his desires to be a writer, to be an artist, because Stephen is very aesthetically minded, and he's marred in classical education, as I said, and yet he is an expat. He's a foreigner even in his own land, because we know that in Portrait of the Artist, he vows to fly by all the nets of nationality and religion and to make for himself his own race. So the idea of some sort of essential identity is really called into question in Joyce, and we can see that he always sort of harkens back to past things, right, to ghosts, because Stephen says, "What is a ghost?" Stephen said, with tingling energy. "One who has faded into impalpability through death, through absence, through change of manners." And yet it always comes back. He says, returning to the world that has forgotten him, who is King Hamlet? So there's always this question of identity that is resurrected through the trace of what the author leaves behind. And what the author leaves behind for Stephen is something pure and something volitional, because Stephen is really unable to glean from authorship the idea of genuine mistakes, because mistakes would be the real downfall. I mean, this would be like calling the crucifixion a mistake for Stephen. Stephen says that a man of genius makes no mistakes. His errors are volitional and are portals of discovery. Portals of discovery opened to let in the Quaker librarian, soft, reek-footed, bald-eared, and assiduous. So he's referring to his friends there at the end. But this idea that the man of genius makes no mistakes is obviously a sort of wish fulfillment of what Stephen would like for himself as an author to be. That he is someone who only makes intentional jumps into the portal of discovery that is the future. It's an attempt to sort of box in the future and discursify it and make sense of it. And this is really the ghost of the son that can't be accounted for the potential of a birth defect, we might say, in the artistic creation. That's something that I think really frightens Stephen. And that's why he is always tenuously, he'll use words like surely or probably or maybe, oftentimes when he's explicating his theory, sort of hedging his bet. So he sort of wants to scoff at his neighbors, at his friends, and he will, for example, inflect this in such a way as he's telling his theory in his head, where he says, "I think you're getting on very nicely. Just mix up a mixture of theological, philological." Right? So he understands that he's sort of spinning a rhetorical web here, that he's at least not entirely serious in the way that he's crafting this, and thereby the artist that Stephen is the same artist that Joyce is, who is an ironist and who has a tenuous relationship to every creation, partially because I think Joyce is sort of obliquely telling us that the author does not control and does not own and cannot take account for the giants of the shoulders upon which they stand, that in part the artist is beholden to givens which they did not create. And yet Stephen, through this sort of rhetorical flourishing, wants to insist that the author can be wholly over that which came before them, that their predecessors really didn't exist and are only a figment of the artist's artistry. He says, "Fatherhood, in the sense of conscious begetting, is unknown to man. It is a mystical estate, an apostolic succession, from only begetter to only begotten. On that mystery, and not on the Madonna which the cunning Italian intellect flung to the mob of Europe, the Church is founded, and found irremovably so, because founded, like the world, macro and microcosm, upon the void, upon incertitude, upon unlikelihood. Amor matris, subjective and objective genitive, may be the only true thing in life. Paternity may be a legal fiction. Who is the father of any son, that any son should love him, or he any son?" So we have a sort of very tenuous recognition of the distance between the artist and what he creates, between the father and the son, that there is some genuine difference there. And yet it seems that the way that Stephen talks about fatherhood and about artistry is such that it is the master, in the sort of Hegelian terminology, the master trying to wholly overwrite the genuine otherness of the slave, trying to subsume the other into an egoistic discourse, where the ego reigns supreme, where the speculations and the fabulated qualities made by the ego override the qualities of the material which is given to and which precedes the artist. And what Stephen is saying here is, in a sense, true, that when we create something, it is not a conscious action of begetting. It is in part because one is a member of a chain of givens which came before one and which impel and compel one to act in a certain way. So this sort of mystical estate, an apostolic succession, is such that one is already begotten by someone else and is already begetting something which one does not fully have a grasp of. Therefore, the incertitude, the void, is the present. It's the unknowability, the inability to discretize all the elements of the present and figure out causally what they will turn into in the future. And that incertitude is, for Joyce and for Stephen, the ground upon which artistic creation is possible at all. So in a sense, Stephen is trying to say something important about authorship, that there is a discontinuity between the elements and the scheme used to turn the elements into something new. Thus, he says, they are sundered by a bodily shame so steadfast that the criminal annals of the world, stained with all other incests and bestialities, hardly record its breach. So the father and son's relationship here is soured by the reality that naturally their relationship is reified through the father and mother's coitus, through an act that oftentimes in the church is not able to be talked about out loud, right? Sex outside of marriage is definitely not only taboo, but a sin. And then even inside sex, it has a sort of tenuous acceptance. It's not the kind of thing that in very pious circles you just tell your friends. There's still a sense of taboo, right? That's why Stephen speaks of these as loves that dare not speak their name. Right, that the actual act of loving is, in a sense, something that cannot be named, because our very name for it would signal the lack or the void, the inability to fully encapsulate this act of creation, right? Imagine trying to tell your child, trying to retell to them the act or the event of their insemination into their mother. I mean, that would be a really weird thing for a number of reasons. First, it would be extremely taboo and probably a little Freudian, but it would also be marred by memory, by the infidelity of time. And therefore, when Stephen is talking about artistic creation, it is on the verge of orthodoxy and heresy. He speaks of the subtlest heresiarch of all the beasts of the field. Because in many ways, Stephen is very pious, and he willfully accedes to the scholarly and theological discourse here as he explicates his theory. And all of this crazy language that he's using Latin inflections and proverbs and whatnot. And yet at the same time, he's also in many key ways enacting his own satanic non serviam, right? He is asserting himself against this void. As Finnegan's Wake says, he is on the void of to be. And therefore, this to be leaves open a pregnant gap. And I think, right, pregnant there is very important, because in a sense it must be filled by the active masculine creative gesture. But on the other hand, it is something which impels its materials on its own. The very medium is pregnant with possibilities that the author cannot fully forestall, nor can he predict. Therefore, Stephen really talks about the sonless father acting on the father to his own fathers. So there's a sense of denying one's predecessors, which is potentially problematic. The way that Satan in Milton's Paradise Lost voices his non serviam is such that he effectually tries to deny the sovereignty of God, right? It's very clear that Milton doesn't want us to think that Satan is smart for saying that he will not serve, because God is the most powerful being in the universe. So, of course, Stephen is, in a sense, denying the materiality, denying the autonomy of his materials. And that is potentially problematic, but Stephen never gets away from it. For example, just a page later, Stephen asks, "What's in a name?" That is what we ask ourselves in childhood when we write the name that we are told is ours. A star, a day star, a fire drake rose at his birth. Right, so this fire drake rose at his birth seems to be an oblique reference to the phoenix that rises from its actions, from its ashes, and from its actions. What a slip. But really, it rises something which it has yet to consciously beget, right? The ashes are of a thing past, and yet they have the capacity bred within them to impel their own creation, right? Before you are created, there are obviously forces working towards your gestation, just as once you're being socialized and learning your name, there are forces which are telling you what your name is. And thereby, they are really naming you in the process by which they try to convince you that you are writing your own name, that you are creating your own name, right? So in this very short little phrase, what's in a name seems to be power. That there is power in words precisely because words have precedent. And I think that there is something potentially usurping and undermining regarding Stephen's theory in that. That the author does not control their language, does not create their predecessors retrospectively, precisely because they have a precedent and a weight of their own. Stephen sort of wants to posture himself as both active agent and passive receptacle to a revelation from God. He says, "Wait to be wooed and won. I, Maycock, who will woo you?" Right? So it's as if he's waiting to be wooed by some revelatory gesture, some opening up of the clouds, whereby things would just become clear to him. And this seems to me to show how the classic notion of authorship is really a non-falsifiable way to talk about the supremacy of the author over their work, to forestall creative interpretation, because the author is both holy master over and the progenitor of everything that they make, and yet at the same time is a sort of prophet of a revelation that came before them and that justifies their work as true, as representative, as a correspondent with reality, right? And therefore a realistic telling of what is the case. So in a sense, Stephen wants to be fabulous artificer, as he puts it, and yet he also wants to be the passive receptacle for Mother Nature. Now, as we get to the conclusion of Stephen's explication, I really see the tension between the sort of two different poles, the orthodox and the critical, coming to an apex here, where he's talking about Shakespeare and talking about the extent to which Shakespeare can be seen in his characters, the extent to which, therefore, the son is implicated in the father and the father implicated in the son, right? The author in their creation, and thus the extent to which the creation could really be heralded in the father ahead of time, which would potentially problematize the free creation of art. He says, it doubles itself in the middle of his life, reflects itself in another, repeats itself. Protasis, epitasis, catastasis, catastrophe. It repeats itself again when he is near the grave, when his married daughter Susan, chip of the old block, is accused of adultery. But it was the original sin that darkened his understanding, weakened his will, and left in him a strong inclination to evil. The words are those of my lord's Bishop of Maynooth, an original sin, and like original sin, committed by another, in whose sin he too has sinned. It is between the lines of his last written words. It is petrified on his tombstone, under which her 4 bones are not to be laid. Age has not withered it. Beauty and peace have not done away with it. It is an infinite variety everywhere in the world he has created. and then he laughed to free his mind from his mind's bondage. The truth is midway, he affirmed. He is the ghost and the prince. He is all in all. So this is really interesting because on the one hand, there is again a deferral to the orthodox position of original sin and that interfering with the fidelity of communication or artistic creation that one could not hope to, for example, communicate because of the Babylonian collapse of the unified language. And, because man is also alienated from God, he is also alienated from his self. His body is acting against his soul, and therefore there is a discontinuity or split within the self. There is a triple banishment that he speaks of, a little bit above where I had just read from. So, right, there is a doubling that Stephen is talking about here, whereby the artist doubles himself as son in order to sort of self-reflexively destroy his own past self as father. He becomes the son without a father and therefore not beholden to that which came before him. And yet the original sin is in between the lines of his last written words, and it is in infinite variety everywhere. So this original sin, this stain or this discontinuity or this lack or this void, whatever we want to call it, is always ramified differently. It is a sort of structural continuity that allows for artistic creation to take place, and yet it has no stability. It is in the in-between spaces. Therefore, we might say that original sin is not it's not a location, it's not an object or a concept, really. It is a dynamic event, a dynamic happening, always reified in each new attempt to create. Therefore, the truth is midway. It is between the author being fully accountable to or author of their works, or, on the other hand, being entirely beholden to their material and therefore not actively involved at all. As such, and this is really interesting because it gets to the heart of Stephen's notion of the relationship to his material and to others, and really gets to the heart of how and why are we writing to another. He says that every life is many days, day after day. We walk through ourselves, meeting robbers, ghosts, giants, old men, young men, wives, widows, brothers in love, but always meeting ourselves. The playwright who wrote the folio of this world, and wrote it badly, he gave us light first and the sun 2 days later. The Lord of things as they are, whom the most Roman of Catholics call Dio Boia, hangman God, is doubtless all in all of us, ostler and butcher, and would be bought and cuckolded too, but that in the economy of heaven, foretold by Hamlet, there are no such marriages, glorified man, an androgynous angel being a wife unto himself. And I've always been very conflicted about this passage. On the one hand, it strikes me as saying something very clear about the nature of human relationships. As Hegel says in his master-slave dialectic, the reason that we can establish some dialectic of recognition with an other is because they are not wholly other. They have some tenuous relationship and commonality with us, and we breach into discourse with another on those terms, on those shared terms, and we try to make up the difference and provide some sort of synthesis for Hegel. So I think in one sense, this is true that we don't just talk to and interact with others to interact with others, but also because it enriches ourselves and, gives us a sense of perspective. But on the other hand, this has always struck me as suspicious and dubious because it seems to premise artistic creation and interaction on the idea that the goal is to get rid of the other. That the goal is that already you are eventually going to find out that it wasn't the other at all, but it was only you that you gleaned. That you always come back to yourself, as if the self was some sort of stable locus that is then followed by a going out and searching out the other and incorporating them, right? So it's a sort of twofold progressive dialectic. But I think that This is the problem with Hegel's dialectics, for example, is it always starts from one pole and moves to another and then retroactively back to it, even if he wants to insist on the sort of equiprimordiality of these poles, that neither precedes the other. It always occurs that way when Hegel talks about it. And I think it's very similar to the way that this is formed, right? That every life, presumably the life of ours, is many days which we are concerned with ourselves and through which we meet other people and then come back to ourselves. But I think that Joyce didn't nearly powerfully enough point out that because of this sort of consubstantiality of the Father and Son and the fact that, writing and truth and identity is this midway, the in-between, is the fact that we don't first have the self and then the others we run into, but the others themselves house the self which we are to become, precisely because we didn't start out as a stable entity, because we were always positioned over this void, and we try to instructively add ourselves into and justify ourselves as if we were always already whole, always already autonomous creatures, forgetting the fact that we had to learn and we had to develop and we had to cover over a lot of the holes that otherwise may confuse us desperately. And the ultimate covering over of this whole, to finally get to what I'd mentioned at the beginning, is when Stephen is asked, "Do you believe your own theory?" "No," Stephen said promptly. And this is really interesting because, in a sense, there is an acknowledgement here, a very important acknowledgement, that the author does not own their creation. And therefore they can't believe in it because it's not something that they can absorb, because it's not something that they wholly created or that stays with them, but that it disseminates outward and is interfered with and also complemented and positively encouraged by the interaction of others. And therefore, he doesn't believe entirely in his theory because belief would be a way to box himself in. He says later, "I believe, O Lord, help my unbelief." That is, help me to believe or help me to unbelieve? Who helps to believe? Egomen. Who to unbelieve? Other chap. This is really interesting. So we have this dialectic between belief, which might be seen as, the having propositional ways and discursive frameworks already in place by which to make sense of and predict the future and therefore create really without the help of intuition or autonomy or artistry. And then on the other hand, unbelief, which is this non serviam, this resistance, this undecidability that is predicated on the void, which is the sort of primordial instability of everything itself. And this unbelief is always helped by the other chap. This makes me think of Jacques Lacan saying that language is always the other's discourse. And that therefore the strictures that provide us with these notions of acceptability of utterances, of proper context, of grammaticality, these are decided by an other which we never are. And therefore we are always alienated from our very tools. And I think that is part of the reason that Stephen cannot accede to his own theory. Part of the reason he therefore does not believe it is because belief is itself a contradiction. That would be too simple of a way to forestall the paradoxical interplay process between Father and Son that is this constant mediation between the Father and Son. Therefore, he says, "I believe, O Lord, help my unbelief." So it's almost as if we have the admittance here, first, of the postulation of belief, that this is first and foremost what Stephen has been taught and what he knows to be true. And he invokes the Lord, and then he just adds in, almost as a realization of the mootness of that original point, that he needs help with his unbelief. Which, notably, I don't think necessarily means get rid of my unbelief, right? It's a sort of attempt to productively use unbelief or something. He says life is many days. This will end. And I think there is an admittance of the finitude of the author and therefore his fallibility here, which really allows unbelief to settle in as a sort of general odor over this chapter, over this whole book, over all of Joyce's oeuvre, which is that the author is dead. As we celebrate Bloomsday and we talk about Ulysses, this author is long gone and leaves us nothing but traces, nothing but really zombified remnants that come to life every time we read. And they ask us, to what extent are we beholden to Joyce? And to what extent is any of this Joyce's? I would argue that to a significant extent, Ulysses is as much ours as readers as it is Joyce's as the author. That because he is dead, he has relinquished his ability to tell us otherwise. All he has left for us is what he has left for us. So all that we have is the attempt to ground our interpretations in context, to deem what is acceptable speculation, and within that framework try to piece together something that the father couldn't have imagined, and therefore to supersede the father and show really one of the powerful aesthetic gestures that Joyce wants us to know, which is that we needed to be taught in order to fly by these nets. As Wittgenstein says at the end of the Tractatus, once the reader has used this work like a ladder, then they can get rid of the ladder, because now it's no longer necessary. You just know it. So knowledge and belief is therefore always something which is to be thrown away, something that can only be after the fact, right? And after the fact because it is done away with, because it has been effaced by something new. And the new is really the pregnant possibility over all of Ulysses. It's the guarantee that there will be a new day, that there will be a new chance to try some of this anew, not in the same way, but anew nonetheless. So that being said, there's a lot of things to think about, and I really implore you as a listener to sort of mull over this and think about, what does it mean to be an author, a father, a son, a brother, an interpreter, a reader, a challenger, right, an iconoclast, which Joyce was in so many ways. So you can check out any of my other lectures that I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap, especially stuff concerning Joyce because of its rarity oftentimes. But no pressure to give. Care about yourself first. That is it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.